makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Over the past few days, I've made various videos discussing the outcomes of the May 6th election in Britain, in particular why Labour performed so poorly, but also the narratives given by the opponents of Labour, both outside and inside the party. This narrative, I think, really doesn't reflect what happened on the ground and the real reasons why Labour performed the way it did, which seems to me there is a common denominator in the areas where Labour did win. This common denominator basically is places where Labour's candidates had a well-defined local agenda that was backed by some optimistic, ambitious vision for the future. In a lot of these cases, these candidates were openly socialist or socialist sympathizing or left sympathizing, in contrast to places where Labour lost, notably the by-election in Hartlepool, where candidates simply could not rely on a national message, a national agenda or manifesto, because quite frankly, Labour under Kier Starmer doesn't have any. However, the narrative that we hear in certain spaces is that Labour lost because the shadow of Corbyn continues to linger, and that Labour has resorted to embracing wokeness. Both of these arguments, I think, are ridiculous. And to prove this, I'm going to show a video from the Henry Jackson Society, a think tank that I guess, a transatlantic think tank that is broadly, I would say, a neoconish, free market-ish. So I don't think they're really interested in Labour ever winning an election, but I think it's more of a case of them kind of beating their enemy when they're down. But it's a short video, and I think it captures the reasons, the narrative that I'm describing, which I think is a very bad analysis of why the election turned out the way it did. And then, to compare, I'm going to show a video, an interview given to Kier Starmer the day after the election, which maybe you've seen this video, maybe you haven't. It's pretty much a car crash interview. And when you see the lack of vision and the lack of, an actual agenda, you'll see why this narrative really doesn't get to the point of why Labour lost. So let's watch the video.
Few in the political mainstream would now argue with the assertion that Jeremy Corbyn was the worst Labour Party leader in recent political history. From delivering one of the party's worst electoral defeats to associating Labour with the scourge of anti-Semitism, his period as leader is one that the party are desperate to put behind them.
All right, first debunking. Labour under Corbyn did not do that bad. This is an objective fact. In 2017, Corbyn obtained 40% of the popular vote, which was the highest since 1974. This is a chart that I made of Labour Party's performance since 1974, which was the last time they won under someone not named Tony Blair. And this 40% is the highest of this whole period, aside from Tony Blair's first two victories, and not much different than in the second victory. So to say that Labour did really, appallingly bad is just factually wrong. Now, I know that in Britain the popular vote doesn't win you an election. Parliamentary seats do. And in this sense, Corbyn didn't do that well. This 2017 victory was still substantial. I mean, it robbed Theresa May's government of its majority, forced them to start a new coalition. But the 2019 defeat was definitely not spectacular in any way. 202 seats. Now, the reasons why there's this gap between the popular vote and the number of seats largely obeys structural factors. There's been seismic shifts in British politics over the past decade. So one example of this would be the loss of Scotland, which used to be a Labour bastion. Now it's dominated by the SNP. And while Scotland doesn't represent a huge amount of the British population, it does represent a more sizable number of seats in Parliament. So that is one reason why Labour has not been able to reflect its popular vote in terms of the number of parliamentary seats it has. So that is, again, not something directly related to Labour. And yeah, so this chart pretty much shows the point that I'm trying to make, that the way that these people are painting Corbyn's supposedly disastrous leadership is not true, not entirely true. So let's keep watching.
To an extent, they've made a good go of it. Since becoming leader, Sir Kier Starmer has kicked out Corbyn, started to repair relations with the Jewish community, and returned Labour to a position of nominal credibility.
Okay, so this idea that there is some sort of nominal credibility in the party, again, is not reflected in its electoral performance. We saw the beating that it received in many parts of the country in terms of the net loss in the number of councillors, mayors, etc. So, and to say nothing of Hartlepool, which was, I think, the more symbolic election that took place that day. So Kier Starmer's popularity right now is appalling. We can look on YouGov. His approval rating is just absolutely terrible. It's been falling since the second half of last year, and I've shown this chart on numerous occasions. And the last time I showed it, it was at this point. This was the most recent one, and he had a 50% disapproval rating versus only a 26% approval rating. And now it's widened even further. Now it's 65% approval versus 17% disapproval. And this is a survey that clearly came after the election. It's dated 10th of May. So if that is normalcy, I don't know what to describe abnormalcy. But this is clearly not normal. And I think even this gap in approval, his net disapproval rating, is as bad as Corbyn's was at his worst. So this idea that Labour's problem was that it was too left is pure BS. Because now we have a guy who clearly has rejected almost the entirety of the Jeremy Corbyn agenda, and rejected Jeremy Corbyn as well, because he was suspended from the party. So here's what happens. Clearly, Labour's problems had nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn being too radical, because now we have a Labour leader that is clearly not radical, and yet has these absolutely appalling approval ratings. So I think we can safely debunk that argument. We can bury it once and for all. It was, there were many issues regarding Corbyn's leadership that were problematic. I think he was not an effective leader and not an effective politician. But the argument that the reason he was so unpopular during various periods was because of his agenda or his ideology, I think this chart definitely proves was not the case. Anyway, let's go back to the video.
Today's English election results, though, show us that these
British elections, by the way. Don't forget Scotland.
steps may be necessary, but they will prove far from sufficient to restore Labour's fortunes. At the core of Labour's challenge is the ever-growing divide between the working-class communities it has long called its heartlands and the metropolitan cities that dominate its leadership and membership.
Here we go. brace yourselves. This is the out-of-touch London metropolitan elite argument. But it gets worse. It gets much, much worse.
The nature of what makes a Labour seat has changed beyond recognition in just a generation. Today, every one of Labour's safest 20 seats is in a city. Almost every Conservative gain in the last election came from a provincial town.
Okay, that is factually true, even though we'll see this argument gradually take shape, and I have a lot of problems with this narrative. That bit is factually true, and that is, the loss of the so-called red wall districts. But what's really problematic is the way that the cause that he attributes to that loss is preposterous, and we're going to hear where it leads to. I hope you can sort of see where it's going.
This has not always been so. Some of Labour's safest London seats were only won decisively by the party for the first time in 1997. While the last two party leaders have represented constituencies in urbane North London, its leadership in a bygone age was more provincial.
That could be true, but is the leadership of the Conservative Party particularly provincial? They're Eton educated prime minister. Is he very provincial? I don't think so. This is what bothers me, that this argument of not being sufficiently provincial is always used against Labour, but somehow never resonates with the Tories. It's never applied to them. And it's sort of this double discourse that we hear. And moving back to the chart that I showed of Kier Starmer's polling, this was used to describe Jeremy Corbyn as unelectable. And yet you don't hear the British media today describe Kier Starmer with these same numbers as unelectable. So we see this complete double discourse, this complete hypocrisy of when we want to describe someone as unelectable, or when we want to describe one party as not provincial enough, it's not used in the same way to describe all parties, even when they're guilty of the same sin. So take that in mind when you hear comments like this. Take a look at whether this could not be applied to the other side, and if so, why then isn't it applied? Why don't we criticize the Tories for not being provincial enough? Why don't we criticize Kier Starmer for being unelectable with these numbers? Just take that into account.
With this change in geography has come a change in priorities. Even following the departure of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party has continued to find itself a victim of its own members' enthusiasm for the culture wars.
There you go. That's what I was expecting this. You should have seen this coming. The culture war. Now it's bad enough that you're already blaming Labour's woes on a guy who has not been his leader for over a year now. But this is the best part of this video, of how he blames Labour's wokeness on their electoral fortunes, and we'll see what's really wrong with this.
Voters, far from being apathetic passengers, notice when they see parliamentarians arguing over pronouns, sympathising with movements responsible for rioting, and seemingly condoning their desecration of the statues of historic heroes.
So this is really disgusting, like absolutely disgusting. And this is just pandering to basically, like, you don't have to be woke, you don't have to be pro SJW to realize just what kind of a shit comment this is, because you're basically just describing one side of all these issues. You're basically saying that BLM, which he's referencing indirectly as leading to riots, you're basically just describing them as rioters. No discussion whatsoever on whether there is some reason why they're rioting. Whether there is some legitimacy in complaints about racism and police violence, which disproportionately affects one particular race, blacks. No mention of why do we have statues of slave owners, which really aren't known for anything else other than maybe they funded one or two charities in a city and they deserved suddenly a statue, despite the fact that their wealth was accumulated through slave ownership. You know, he's basically wanting to paint like every statue that's been pulled down as a statue of Churchill or some other historic hero, as he's describing, when the fact is a lot of the statues that have been pulled down really are people that most people didn't even know who they were until they were pulled down. And you know, when I walk, I consider myself a pretty historically cultured human being. I know a lot about history, but even then, when I walk through the streets of London, probably half the statues I see, I have no idea who they were. And I'm sure that if you go to other cities, you'll also see a statue, and you know, you won't know what this person was famous for. And maybe he wasn't really famous for anything, but he was a slave owner. And you really have to question why we have statues of people who didn't really do that much, but clearly had money obtained through slave ownership, and paid their way into having a statue there. So that's what he's not describing. So all of this is just wrong. You know, caring for these issues is clearly wrong. Now, he goes on, and this is what is so despicable about this argument. Let's listen.
Many in Labour's new heartlands and middle-class cities will have cheered when they saw Starmer take a knee in sympathy with Black Lives Matter. Many will have agreed when some Labour politicians showed discomfort at the thought of unequivocally backing Winston Churchill. Those new heartlands could not be further away from the likes of Hartlepool, however. In these patriotic communities, these issues have been settled in a very different direction, and not in the way many on the left would like them.
Okay. Well,
voters here want tough policies on immigration. They want support for the police, the military, and, yes, statues of our historic heroes. They know.
So, what this guy is basically saying is that people in places like Hartlepool are racist. That really is what he's saying. Because what he's saying is you have voters who would perhaps be presented with the realities of over a decade of Tory rule, of Tory austerity, and seeing their communities deprived, maybe in poverty, relying on food banks, things like that. And you have a party that's offering you an alternative to this. But you choose not to vote for that party because, oh my God, their leader took a knee in support of BLM, which he did. Starmer took the knee. A photo op. But nevertheless, he took a knee. And you decide not to vote for that party. The only people who do this are racists. And let me be absolutely unequivocal about this. That is not the people that the Labour Party needs to pander to. Fuck them. Really. Like, I can't be more blunt about it. Fuck them. If Labour can't win because everyone in these communities is a racist, fuck them. They deserve the party that they vote for. They deserve Tory austerity, Tory deprivation, etc. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think the grand majority of people who switched to the Tories in 2019 in these communities, like Hartlepool, which was heavily Brexit voting, I don't think that they're all racist. I do think there are racists. I definitely do think that there are people who voted the way I just described, or that he's describing. Just because there is racism in places like Hartlepool, there is racism in the north, there is racism in all of Britain. That is a fact. But I don't think that explains the way that these communities voted. And I think no one, on the left or on the right, will doubt that Brexit was really the reason that swayed them to vote Tory. And this is an argument that I probably would not have made before 2019, but now I'm willing to concede, is that Labour probably should have decided to respect the results of the referendum from the very start and be clear that there wasn't going to be a second one, and that they were gonna present a much more pro-worker version of Brexit than what the Tories would have presented. And I really was uneasy about this argument before 2019. In retrospect, I think there's a case to be made for it. I'm not saying I fully support it, because I also think that Labour should have either called from the start their support for a second referendum, rather than this wishy-washy, you could say they were, anti-Brexit, but then that Corbyn was a closet Brexiteer from the left, and that went nowhere. I think Labour's main issue in terms of policy during the Corbyn era was not defining its stance on Brexit until at the very, very last moment in 2019. That was a huge mistake. And I'm willing to concede that maybe Labour would have done better by actually backing Brexit from the very start. So this election was defined by Brexit, which it wasn't in 2017, ironically. And I don't think that the behavior of the average voter in a place like Hartlepool was framed by wokeness. It was not framed by the culture war. Because while I do think that this voter that he is describing and that I just described does exist, someone who will vote happily against their own class interest and against their own financial interests by voting Tory, because they couldn't stand the thought of voting for a party whose leader took the knee in support of BLM. Yes, I do think that person exists, but I don't think that they are the grand majority of voters in these communities. That's an insult to these communities. You're basically labeling all of them essentially racist. Because you have to be a racist to decide not to vote for a party just because someone supported BLM, while the other one, you are conscious, you are aware that they've fucked you over. Right? So this was not a case of like the Trump voter who voted for change, because you're not voting for change by continuing to vote for Tories. That logic does not apply. And I know a lot of people on the right, especially sort of the populist right, love to make this argument. But it doesn't apply here because the Tories have been in power. And as a local community, as a local district, local council, you can only do so much in terms of the policies for your constituents, in terms of economic policy, especially, because Britain is not a federal republic. Local councils do not have that much power. They can make change. There's been good examples of this, both on the Tory side as well as on Labour. But it's limited. So what he's basically describing is that all these voters are racist. And that's really despicable.
Notice who is and who is not backing these positions. The Labour Party is not alone in facing down this challenge. Across the world, progressive parties are struggling to ensure that, on cultural issues, their policies align with working class people. It will be essential for their prospects that they do. Unless Labour can find a way to reconnect with its traditional base, it will find itself incapable of ever reassuming electoral power.
So, summary, it needs to reconnect with its supposedly racist working class base. That's kind of what he's saying. Abandon wokeness. But then, Labour didn't run on wokeness. The fact that Kier Starmer may have had a photo op taking the knee, the fact that there are some members of the Labour Party who are openly in support of progressive issues, that does not mean the party ran on this platform. Certainly not in Hartlepool. So where does he get this? Where on the Labour agenda can you see like this support of wokeness? I've basically said that Labour doesn't have an agenda. So if it doesn't have an agenda on anything, it clearly doesn't have an agenda on wokeness. And if you're the kind of person who is swayed by these few sporadic symbols of pro-woke attitudes from Labour or from Kier Starmer, I'll say again, fuck you. Like, the party should not pander to people like you. I'm sorry, that's, full stop. Fuck you. So, let's end this video.
But for the country, another threat lurks. We have seen that amidst these hard-working northern communities, people who feel unrepresented have sometimes turned to the political extremes. Both the far right and far left have made inroads here in recent years. For now, these towns are finding representation in Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. But they will eventually need more representation than that if it is found wanting in delivering their aspirations. The gap that has emerged between voters and their leaders in recent years has delivered political upsets, but it also could prove a boon for political extremes.
So this is obviously a claim that will be tested in the next few years. And we've seen the emergence of very extreme parties, mostly on the right. I mean, there hasn't been an extreme left party emerge in Britain, I think. But we have seen the likes of the Brexit Party, UKIP, etc., whose voters eventually shifted back to the Tories after Brexit kind of became irrelevant. And a good test will see if the new generation of extreme right parties, and I know there's one sort of the heir to the Brexit Party, which is called I think the Reform Party. I could be wrong. We'll see if these parties make inroads in places like Hartlepool or the northern Redwall districts in general, as opposed to where they might make inroads in more traditional conservative constituencies. I'm not sure. I don't know. That is definitely a possibility. But I think if my argument that these places voted primarily because of Brexit, I don't think they'll make huge inroads. Because these parties will really not be supportive of working class issues. They will be focused primarily on culture war issues. And if the reason that these communities voted Tory in 2019 or in places like Hartlepool a week ago, I genuinely don't see a future for these parties there. I don't think that's going to be their main bastions of support. So, but we'll see. Like I said, this is a testable hypothesis. Politics is in many ways like science. You can test things on the ground. And so far, nothing of what he said has any basis on reality. Because as I described, there were common denominators in the places that Labour won on May 6th. And it has nothing to do with what this guy is saying.
Last night, the Labour Party was reminded how out of touch it continues to be with its once loyal electorate. Not only would it be in the Labour Party's interest for it to start speaking language and policies that working class people respect.
Apparently racist language, from what he's describing. Because God forbid you say anything in favor of black people. God forbid you even remotely suggest that Winston Churchill was racist. God forbid you mention he might have been responsible for the Bengal famine. That will not go well. And last time I checked, that was not part of Labour's agenda. I don't see where there is a clause in their agenda or whatever manifesto they might have where they said from now on public schools will teach that Churchill was in fact a racist and he caused the Bengal famine. And will tear down every single statue of every person who once owned a slave. Last time I checked, that was not part of the agenda. So I don't know where he's getting it. It's basically a giant political straw man.
But it might just make our society more cohesive too.
So, now that we've watched that, let's watch Starmer give his reasons for why Labour did so bad. And we'll see exactly the points that I made over the course of this video, that it's the lack of of a vision for the future, that is problematic. And this is a car crash interview in any sense of the word. I really think that it highlights the point that I made earlier, that why on earth is the media not describing Kier Starmer as unelectable when it so casually would use that phrase to describe Jeremy Corbyn, when he had, car crash interviews or appalling net approval, or rather net disapproval ratings. So let's see this video. And if you haven't, maybe you've seen it, but I still want to show it. And I promise this is the last video I make on the May 6th election. I think after I finish this video, I've wrapped up everything I need to say, and we'll just see if I'm proved right in the near future.
We're just going straight to Sir Kier Starmer.
But we haven't set out a strong enough case to the country. Very often we've been talking to ourselves instead of to the country, and we've lost the trust of working people, particularly in places like Hartlepool. I intend to do whatever is necessary to fix that.
What will you do? Because some people in your party are going to say you need to move more towards the Jeremy Corbyn agenda, others away from it.
This is not a question of left or right. It's a...
It kind of is. I mean, your party has to have an ideology. And even if you decide that you're going to move Labour to the centre ground, you will have to side with either the left or the right on certain key issues. I've always argued this. Like, centrism isn't being on the centre in every single policy. A real centrist will side with the left or with the right, where they see fit. Like, what's the centrist position on climate change, for example? So this is just silly. I mean, Labour is a leftist party by history, by tradition. He can't just like, oh, we don't have an ideology anymore. That's ridiculous. Like, that is at the heart of why it's so obvious that he doesn't have a project for his party and for the country.
Question of whether we're facing the country. We have changed as a party, but we've not made a strong enough case to the country. We've lost that connection, that trust, and I intend to rebuild that and do whatever is necessary to rebuild that trust.
So he's had a year to do this. I mean, he's had a year in which literally his main job has been to disassociate his brand of Labour, his leadership of Labour, with Corbyn. He's had a year to present that case, and the results clearly show that people aren't buying it.
What does change mean in, say, policy terms?
It means stopping as a party, quarrelling amongst ourselves, looking internally and facing the country and setting out.
That's not a policy. He was asked a very specific question, like, name a policy. And this is not a policy. All parties have internal squabbles. How you deal with them really matters. And he can't also disown the fact that the Blairite faction under Corbyn was, hugely responsible for a lot of the internal frictions that it had. So, like, how is his side not responsible for the problems that they caused under Corbyn? But now suddenly conflict is bad. That's a classic sort of centrist trope. When they're in power, they expect everyone to fall in line. But when they're not in power, they're the ones who are sowing the seeds of discord. That is classic centrist logic. This double standard that everyone needs to fall in line with them when they're in power, because they see themselves as the only kind of legitimate heirs to power. Centrism is not an ideology. I want to make that very clear. It's not an ideology the way the left or progressiveness or socialism is an ideology, or conservatism is an ideology. Centrism is a means to power, to remain in power. It's a strategy for power. It's not an ideology. So he's kind of confirming this.
that bold vision for a better Britain and
Sorry,
changing
Kier,
the things
what is
that
that
need
vision?
changing.
What
And
is that
that is
vision?
the change that I will bring about.
Len McCluskey, Unite General Secretary, says people don't know what you stand for. What is that vision?
Our vision is of a country that ends the injustice and inequality that millions of people face every day. But fundamentally, we have to show that we are facing the country, that we've learnt the lessons of this bitterly disappointing set of results.
He still hasn't mentioned any policy, like at all. I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? Like, do you think people don't see through this? The video from the Henry Jackson Society tried to make the case that people sort of pick up on the wokeness and then decide on not voting for Labour. Doesn't he realize that, in fact, what people pick up is this lack of vision, this lack of an agenda? This is far more easy to pick up, I think, than their sort of woke sympathies.
You say you take personal responsibility for the results. Are you up to the job of Labour Party leader?
Yes, and I intend not only to take responsibility for the results, but to take responsibility for fixing things. And I will set out what change is needed over the next few days, but I'm absolutely clear in my mind and absolutely determined to do whatever is necessary to fix things and to make sure we can make that case to the country in a compelling way.
What are you going to
I should add that his first act on fixing things and taking personal responsibility was sacking Angela Rayner. That is the first thing he did. I'm pretty sure that happened after this video, but the guy who's right now saying that he's going to take personal responsibility, first thing he did, sack one of his deputies.
change over the next few days? What are you referring to?
I will set out what we need to do to reconnect the Labour Party to the voters that have cast their verdict on us last night, particularly in places like Hartlepool. We have changed as a party. We have changed as a party, but we need to go further and we need to set out that strong case to the country. We have not.
Further where? And don't you think if you're going to present that case, you need a national project first? You've had a year to do this. You haven't done it. I mean, come on. This is just basic. I struggle to see who can't see a video like this and not realize what the real problem of Labour is, instead of fictitious problems like it's still Corbyn's fault or it's wokeness. You can't see this video and not realize that it's the lack of vision.
Not done that.
So you're going to set out a new policy agenda, is that what you're saying?
I am going to set out a strong case to the country, learn the lessons.
How are you going to build this case? You're being asked a specific question. You were asked to name policies. He still hasn't named anything. Now he's asked whether this change will involve a new policy agenda, and he still doesn't answer it. I mean, Jesus Christ.
Of the elections that have come in so far, and accept that we must reconnect and rebuild trust with working people, particularly in places like Hartlepool.
Can you give us any indication of what it is you're going to be
Well, I'm not
talking
going to set out a policy agenda in this interview, but I'm going.
No, you should have had one. Obviously, no one's expecting you in, the 2 minutes 48 seconds that this interview has started, that suddenly you've created a manifesto in your mind. You should have already had this. I mean, you're basically admitting that you had no policy agenda, that you're gonna make one, but it's been a year and you have nothing. This is insane.
To set out how we reconnect and rebuild that trust.
Are you going to reshuffle your top team?
We've lost 4 general elections. We've just had a bitterly disappointing set of results last night. This goes way beyond a reshuffle or personalities. It's about focusing the Labour Party on the country and making sure that we close the gap between the Labour Party and working people.
Sorry, I'm not clear though. Are you going to reshuffle your top team?
Closing the gap? What does that even mean? This interview is just basically word salad, just complete word salad. You can basically make an algorithm of write a Kier Starmer speech, and just pick certain words and shift the verbs here and there, and you end up with your standard Kier Starmer speech. That's really what it is. An algorithm could do a better job than you.
We have lost
Yes
four.
or no?
We have lost 4 general elections in a row. We've bitterly disappointing results last night. This goes way beyond a reshuffle, goes way beyond personalities. It goes to the core issue of whether the Labour Party is talking to itself or talking to the country.
Sorry, Sir Kier, yes or no, are you going to reshuffle your top team?
I've said that, as far as I'm concerned, we've been losing elections for 10 or 11 years. This is much more fundamental than a reshuffle or personalities.
OK, well, I'm not clear what the answer is in that case. But just finally, is the Labour Party facing an existential crisis?
No. But the Labour Party has to rise to the challenge of reconnecting with working people. We were set up to represent working people. We need to reconnect, rebuild that trust. That means learning the lessons of the results that are in so far and putting a much stronger and bolder case to the country.
Well, you clearly haven't learned the lessons because you're basically, in this interview, one day later, all you can come up with is word salad. I mean, not even one single policy. Like you can't name one single thing that Labour would do on a national level. I wouldn't expect Kier Starmer to be fully knowledgeable about Hartlepool's local issues. But on a national level, you can at least say one thing. Say one thing that differentiates you from the Tories. One thing that you'll do that they won't. And write on that. And you've had a year and you can't do it.
But sorry, Sir Kier, you're not setting out your new policy agenda or what might change precisely. You're not saying whether you're going to reshuffle your top team. Are you really going to deliver change?
Yes, we have already changed as a party. We need to go further. And
further where? Like more right wing? So like, is there a limit to like how centrist you can move? Because the more you move in the direction, away from Corbyn, the more right wing you become. So is that really what you're saying? That you think Labour should go back to sort of Blair era, free market, free trade, deregulate, be in bed with the financial industry? Is that your project for Labour? I'm sure the people of Hartlepool are going to love it. They're absolutely drooling over deregulating the financial industry. I'm sure they're going to love it. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. And let me be clear. In 2021, and I think this will apply all the way to 2024, you will not win on a Blairite agenda. That is gone. Centrists can't win elections anymore in countries like Britain or the US, countries that are gripped by inequality, where injustice is perceptible to most people. And you have only 2 options. You offer either an openly leftist agenda, which is what apparently Kier Starmer is terrified of, or you offer a national populist agenda, which is what the Tories have become. There's a reason why the Tories have become. It's not some fluke of history. It's not just because it's Bojo in charge. It takes this approach because it knows it cannot win on the traditional policies of conservative governments. It's the same with the Republicans in the US. There's a reason why Trumpism is now the standard in the Republican Party, because they will not be able to run. You will not win an election these days on the policy platform of the conservatism of like 1995 or even 2005. That era is gone. So I really would want to know what he means by we need to go further. Further where, Kier?
in particular, we need to set out a stronger case about the future of our country to the country and face the electorate, not internally to the party.
You happy? We can keep going if you like.
No, that's...
I love that ending. I think it's so fitting to
This revolutionary dental device is giving peace of mind for less.
Yeah, I love that ending. Just so appropriate to the car crash that preceded it. So there you go. These are my final thoughts on what happened. I think that is this is the last video of this arc that I'm gonna do. We'll see where Labour goes from here. We'll see if they really learn the lessons of these defeats, and not just the lessons of the defeats, the lessons of the victories, because there were victories on May 6th. And I think repeating my point that politics, to some degree, is a science. You can test things, you can test theories on the ground, you can see what works and what doesn't. And I think your job as a political leader is to see what works, in the most cold, scientific way possible. And he's clearly not doing it. And if he listens to the bullshit analysis that you're listening to from places like the Henry Jackson Society, which is indistinguishable from the arguments that people, that Labour's own critics are giving, Labour's centrist critics, like Peter Mandelson, for example, which I discussed in a previous video. If that's the narrative that you're going to buy, you're not doing analysis. You're basically just doing ideology. And that's how you lose elections. And you're not going to beat the Tories at their own game, at their populist, nationalist way. You're not going to win them over by pretending that you love the flags. And you're not going to also win them over by suddenly being terrified of these accusations of wokeness that are just not grounded in reality. I think this may be an excuse that maybe could be applied to the Democratic Party, because they love symbolic wokeness, even if there's no substance behind it. I think that would be a case that you can make. But I just don't see Labour under Starmer embrace that kind of superficial, hypocritical wokeness that you see. So just my final comment is, don't buy into these really bad narratives. Look on the ground, see what happens, look at the common denominators of what was successful, and mold your party on the basis of those successes, because they worked. They worked on a local level, and all that's needed is an agenda that echoes those same sentiments to be your national platform, because you will not have the same, perhaps charismatic local leaders that you have, or the same sort of tried and tested local models that you have in places like Preston, for example, that they even have a name for it, the Preston model of local development. You won't have this in every place you run. So you need a national agenda to be able to make up for that. And from this interview, I just don't think that Kier Starmer is really that committed to it. So we'll see. This is very depressing, because I think myself, along with most decent people, want to see the Tories out. And already 2024 seems so far into the future. The idea that they've been in power for pretty much a decade and a half. The idea that it could be another 2 decades, a repeat of the Thatcher Major era. That won't be good for the country in any way. So that's my last video on May 6th, I promise. But I will still be commenting on British politics on a regular basis. So like and subscribe, and I will say what I say at the end of every video. This is a new channel. I appreciate every new subscriber. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.